Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We'll just wait a minute or two for more people to join. Hi, everyone has joined. We're just letting people in now before we get started. Welcome everyone, and on behalf of C&D, thank you for joining us for this webinar this evening, Invest in Peace, Not Nukes. I'm Sarah Meddy-Jones, C&D's Campaigns Director, and this meeting is part of a national focus by C&D in 2025 on Britain's nuclear bases. We want to put the spotlight on both their huge dangers and financial costs as part of the wider campaign against Britain's nuclear weapons. This year, we've protested already at Barrow Shipyard in Cumbria, at the Lakenheath Air Base in Suffolk, and now we're headed to Devonport Dockyard in Plymouth on June the 7th. The dockyard services the current generation of submarines which carry Britain's nuclear missiles. We hope through our discussion this evening that we can explore the specific problems with Devonport as a nuclear base and the wider implications of a community and economy prioritising the maintenance of Britain as a nuclear armed state. The billions being wasted here and elsewhere on nuclear weapons could be spent on social welfare instead, redirected into creating highly skilled, well-paid jobs. So we have fantastic speakers joining us this evening to progress this discussion. They will give an initial talk and then there'll be plenty of time for them to answer your questions. So for this purpose, we ask that you ask away anything that you would like to ask the panel, but we do ask that you use the Q&A box for all the questions just to make sure we don't miss any. But feel free to use the chat to share links or points of information with others. So we'll get started then. And speaking first will be Tony Staunton, C&D Vice Chair, member of Plymouth C&D, and the main organiser of the demonstration I mentioned on June the 7th. He's here today to give the local perspective on living near the dockyard. So over to Tony.
Lovely, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen so you don't have to look at my wonderful face all the time. Welcome to Plymouth. I hope everybody can see that. Am I there? Yeah.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I'm here to talk about Plymouth, but it is in the context of the Trident nuclear program that others will be talking about. But here you see only part of the 4 miles of military docks on the western end of Plymouth, which is a city of 270,000 people. And across the road that you see on the left are residential buildings. It's right on the city, and it's where people live. It's not simply a naval dockyard out of the way, such as Faz Lane. It's a Ministry of Defence naval dockyard. There's Navy personnel there, but it's owned privately, and that's another whole discussion we could have over the privatisation of the nuclear weaponry of Britain and the United States. But Babcock International has a turnover of 4.5 billion a year, is a major player in the military and arms industry, and is benefiting massively from this government's increase in military spending. It's here for nuclear submarine refits, for deep maintenance, defueling and dismantling, and you will know it from the Vanguard class submarines that apparently one of them has to be on duty at any one time, ready to fire first if there's a nuclear crisis. But it's going to be here for the new Trident replacement dreadnought submarines, should they ever happen. You can see there one of the docks. There's 14 nuclear submarines, all decommissioned, but bobbing at anchor because they don't know what to do to decommission them. They have their nuclear cores inside, and they have to be kept safe. It costs £30 million a year for that square in the bottom right of your screen to be kept safe, as they call it. There's 5,500 employees all told, and it's said to be the heart of Plymouth and more important than everything else that goes on in our city. But Plymouth University alone has more employees. They're now seeing job cuts. Derriford Hospital has 11,000 in the city, 11,000, with huge cuts of £100 million in this year, and 100 schools with about 5,000 employees, and they, of course, are facing severe cuts too. Babcock, the owners of what you see in front of you, is actually being paid by the taxpayer £1 billion for a refit of Dock 10, which is just above the picture, for the Dreadnought submarines. So you can see there's £1 billion just to make the dock bigger and deeper, whilst there's no money for any public services at all. Really, if you were to stop nuclear weaponry tomorrow, which of course is what we're campaigning for, it would take 100 years to actually make this area safe from radiation, at least 100 years, because there's radioactive isotopes. Now, what we have in Plymouth is two rivers that come in east and west of the city, and they flow into Plymouth Hoe, which is a marvelous inner shoreline and dock area, and that has been found to have every human-made radioisotope that has ever been created. In fact, so many that there's satellites that are able to give three-dimensional maps of the flows and the eddies and currents inside Plymouth Hoe from the two rivers and from the sea, because of all the different radioactive isotopes that Plymouth Dockyard has actually secreted into the sea. And if you think about that, then of course it's in our air and it's in our mud and it's in our earth here as well. We did complain about this in the noughties. We had two big demonstrations of over 1,000 people, and we complained to the Environment Agency, who promptly agreed that there was a lot of radioisotope activity and saw that tritium levels were very high, so they increased sevenfold the required levels that were allowed by law. In other words, we didn't get very far. There's been 10 nuclear leaks at the dockyard in the last 30 years, serious fires this century, and there is a succession of inspection fines and warnings, but all the time we are told in our local press and politicians that it's very safe here. The radioactive nuclear waste here, the low and medium level, is stored in drums on a wall 400 feet from the primary school that is just at the other side of the main gates across a dual carriageway. And they also built an incinerator here of German design from the 1980s, right next to the nuclear waste, which has had 4 incidents on the continent of blowing up since the 1980s when it was when they were first designed. So we have lockdown drills. The school has 2 fire alarms, one for fire when they all evacuate, and one for radiation when they have to hide under the desk, close all the doors and windows, and parents aren't allowed to come and pick the kids up. We used to be given potassium iodide pills, but no more. They think it's too safe to bother to do anything like that in case of a nuclear accident, because they simply say there's never going to be a nuclear accident. Meanwhile, a couple of years ago, we had the Vanguard submarine, Trident submarine, towed in HMS Astute and had to have Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of nuclear warheads unloaded at the dockside. And in February 2023, we had another nuclear submarine that was found that they had discovered cracks in the nuclear reactor and had glued the cracks back together. So we don't believe in this safety very much at all. There's also an extremely big amount of security leaks, not least when 3 protesters got on board a Vanguard submarine, and in the end, in the middle of the night, had to phone the police to come and arrest them because nobody seemed to be bothered that they were there. In the meantime, right the way the housing and communities around the dockyard live in poverty. 1 in 3 children in Devonport live in poverty. We see major deprivation indicators, twice the national rate, and poor health, with incredible levels of difference in life expectancy based on class and where they live in the city. Babcock profits and the salaries of the scientists at the dockyard don't stay in Plymouth. So when they say it makes Plymouth rich, actually all the money goes outside and all the well-paid staff don't live in Plymouth. But we are dominated by propaganda. Both our MPs are very pro-nuclear. Luke Pollard is the Armed Forces Minister. Fred Thomas is an ex-Royal Marines officer. The local council champions the dockyard, despite making massive cuts to its own staff. And of course, they're all Labour Party, Labour government and Labour Council members. We also have the Health Service and University who are tied to Babcock. The university gets major funding from Babcock, and the Health Service uses naval personnel to prop up its staff. So we have to defy all the false promises, because the reports that are coming out now that Trident replacement will create an extra 20,000 jobs in Plymouth and district are pure fantasy. And the demonstration in part is simply to highlight that. What's the future look like? Well, Plymouth Nuclear Private Dockyard is part of a new Freeport enterprise that has taken in the whole of Dartmoor that we sit on the edge of, with major tax exemptions for Babcock, deregulation, as well as some greenwash that we have to expose all the time. The decommissioning will continue whatever happens. So we're not, when we call for the end of Trident, we're not calling for the end of the nuclear dockyard, because we need jobs there for 100 years to clean it up. But Plymouth could be the global centre for climate jobs, not nuclear and military, you know, the swords into ploughshares routine. The Trident replacement at the moment is on £13 billion a year, although the National Audit Office is saying the whole thing, particularly Dreadnought, but the whole programme is out of control in terms of costs. So we're constantly having to talk about the jobs, the good climate jobs that could be done and funded by the same money if only we shut down Trident nuclear submarines and nuclear armaments. But we're told all the time that we're in a rearmament and a pre-war situation. And that just means that Plymouth is a military target and we get no outside investment. Just look at what Japan has created in this underwater turbine. We could have been creating those 20 years ago, and we were saying this 20 years ago. So here's a picture to leave you with of Plymouth Hoe at dusk. I'm 10 minutes walk away from here. It's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful city that is unfortunately full of radioactive isotopes. But nevertheless, if we got rid of the military nuclear dockyard, we would be a wonder of the new world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Yeah, what a lovely photo. What a shame what sort of lurks beyond that. So thanks very much. We'll hear from Tony again a bit later in answer to your questions. But now I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Gordon. Alex is the former president of trade union RMT and is personally a trade unionist who has consistently stood up for peace over the years. So thanks for that, Alex, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be able to join the CND webinar, Invest in Peace, Not Nukes. And I'm proud that my union, RMT, has been affiliated to CND for many, many years. I'm sorry I haven't got a beautiful PowerPoint like Tony Staunton, but you'll just have to look at me instead. My friend and former RMT General Secretary, Bob Crow, used to say that RMT members have all the same reasons as every other working class person to campaign for peace and against war. But RMT has an additional reason, because we represent the seafarers in the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which is the civilian logistics arm of the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines. These are civilian workers who are deployed directly into theatres of war. Unfortunately, sadly, Bob Crow died in 2014, but if he were here today, I believe he would have been marching alongside us against Britain's collusion with Israel's genocide in Gaza, against British planes bombing Yemen, and against the Starmer government's policy of funding and fueling a war in Ukraine. Above all, Bob would have been aghast at the eye-watering profligacy of the Trident renewal program, the nuclear submarine the program that Tony Staunton has just been talking about in Plymouth, which is now predicted to cost £205 billion at a time when we're told by Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that she won't lift the two-child benefit cap. She has to cut winter fuel allowance, renege on Labour's promise to WASPy women, and cut personal independence payments that allow disabled people to live independent lives. Next month, her cross-departmental spending review will require 5% spending cuts across government departments. For anyone who wants to read an antidote to this madness, I recommend the excellent article in today's Morning Star newspaper by the former chair of Scottish CND and a member, I believe, of the Scottish Trade Union Network, Arthur West. And I've just, I think, popped that into the chat for anyone who wants to have a look at it. It's entitled "Welfare, Not Warfare Must Be Our Rallying Cry." Arthur points out that Keir Starmer pledged to increase Britain's military budget to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. But research by the Peace Pledge Union shows that remarkably, in 2024, Britain was already the 5th highest military spending country in the world. The UK already spends more on its military than France, Germany, and Spain in both nominal terms and as a share of our gross domestic product. Without accounting for the planned increase that Starmer talks about, or the anticipated cost overruns, which are an inevitable feature of military spending projects, the UK will spend a minimum of £288.6 billion on military equipment over the next decade. As the only major manufacturing sector to be directed by government contracts, the military industry consumes a disproportionate share of the skilled research and development workforce. Between 1987 and 2009, the military sector received 35% of the UK's public R&D funding. And research by the Scottish Trade Union Peace Network and CND has shown that military spending has one of the lowest employment multipliers of all economic categories. This research shows that investing in areas such as health is around 2.5 times more jobs rich than investment in military spending. The research also shows that investment in areas such as construction and other manufacturing sectors is also far more jobs rich than military spending. And indeed, Diane Abbott, MP, has just tabled an early day motion calling for the reversal of the international aid cuts announced in Rachel Reeves's spring financial statement, her spring budget, and other public spending cuts that were made in order to fund increased defence spending, or arms spending, as we should really call it. In 2025, UK government ministers repeatedly held up military spending as, quote, an engine of growth for the British economy. But as the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves demonstrated in her spring statement, increased military spending occurs at the expense of other areas of public spending. Her 2025 spring statement budget funds the increase in defence spending that was previously announced by Starmer in February by cutting overseas aid. And the economic fallacy of military Keynesianism, so-called, which is recycled by advocates of arms spending, relies on an assertion that military spending generates wider positive economic and social effects through the development of technology, research and development investment, and jobs. But building a tank, bomb, or a missile system confers little benefit to the wider economy and zero benefit in terms of efficiency, speed, or productivity in other economic sectors. By contrast, investment in public infrastructure, such as new roads, railways, or technology in universities, rarely generates a direct financial profit, but benefits to the end users, that's us, and consumers through quicker journey times, cheaper fares, and transportation costs, new medical procedures or scientific techniques, raise prosperity generally across society, and benefit the government as well through tax receipts from the increased economic activity. Military spending generates a smaller economic multiplier than other public investments, meaning it generates less overall economic activity and fewer secondary benefits than spending on essential services or infrastructure. One example of this is the public investment multiplier effect. In 2019, every £1 that was spent in the rail industry generated £2.50 of income, a 250% increase in income generation through investment in railways. The UK rail sector supported £43 billion of economic production and raised just over £14 billion in tax revenue. And that's according to research by Oxford Economics. So investing in a new rail network in Devon, for example, would benefit local communities through improved services, job training, and increased employment. In contrast, producing a fighter jet or a nuclear submarine offers more limited economic benefits, mainly through the spending of those directly employed in its production. And with global supply chains in the labour force, many of these benefits are increasingly offshored. So the new military Keynesians, such as John Healey, the Secretary of State for Defence, also claim that military spending is jobs rich. However, as I discussed earlier, military spending does not add to the productive capacity of the economy, so it has zero net economic benefit. Claims that it is jobs rich rely on unevidenced assertions about MOD procurement, on job creation in the arms industry. There are other, more efficient sectors in which public money can create high-skilled, higher-waged jobs. And finally, much of the profit generated by the arms industry is not reinvested in the UK. The defence sector's biggest firm in this country, BAE Systems, British Aerospace, is effectively a joint US and UK company. A majority of its capital as a company is invested in the United States, and the majority of its major shareholders are US investment companies, of which BlackRock is the biggest. So in conclusion, Sarah, it's absolutely essential that we blow apart this fallacy that is being promoted by John Healey, by Rachel Reeves, by Keir Starmer, and by your local MPs in Plymouth, such as Luke Pollard, that the arms industry is a creator of jobs and wealth for working people. It isn't creating wealth for working people, it's displacing wealth from working people. It's creating profits for US arms monopolies, and it is going to poison our planet and possibly kill us and our children. So it's really important that we get behind the campaign that C&D has launched to draw attention to these nuclear bases and say it's time to shut them down. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Some really sort of interesting points there expressed in a really sort of clear way. And that is what we do need to do more of, sort of expose these myths and get that message out there. And yeah, show me someone that doesn't want cheaper train fares, and we'll show you a liar, basically. But want to say hello as well to everyone in the chat. A few people. We've got someone from Hawaii, we've got someone from Croatia, and that's really nice to sort of have you with us today. This is also, of course, is an international problem. Nuclear weapons exist across the world, and it is through that international understanding and learning from each other that we can hopefully advance our campaigns. So welcome to you all, and it's nice to have you here. So we'll move on now to our final speaker, Sophie Bolt. Sophie is C&D's General Secretary. And while we've heard from Tony and Alex, sort of the massive problems and the things we want to challenge, I'm hoping Sophie will sort of go more into what we can do about it and what sort of those options are to take it all forward. So yeah, please keep your questions coming in the Q&A box. But for now, over to Sophie. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and also thank you to Tony and to Alex. I mean, I think sort of Tony's presentation was like horrifying, really, wasn't it? Like, hair raising. But this is the whole reason why we have to be doing this, is to sort of be showing the realities of the sort of the nuclear industry, but also really powerful words from Alex in terms of sort of the alternatives, and totally debunking this whole argument that sort of war and militarism is some sort of dynamic economic growth miracle. It's the total opposite. So I'll sort of be more of a sort of a national sort of overview, but hopefully, yes, then kind of what we're doing and what we can do. I mean, this was like the sort of beginning of sort of May, but I don't know if people sort of saw Keir Starmer's speech to commemorate the 80th anniversary of VE Day, the sort of defeat of fascism in Europe. But I found it absolutely horrifying. And really kind of shocking how he was sort of prepared to sort of exploit, all that sort of grief and horror of war. And, but also, the fact that the world had sort of defeated fascism at that time, he turned that into a PR exercise for militarism, and specifically for the nuclear weapons industry. Sort of talking about, national security is economic security, really sort of gruesome exploitation, sort of manipulation of sort of young people, the future aboard these sort of nuclear submarines, as it, presented as something sort of bright and hopeful. I think very sort of shocking, but I think that sort of gives you a sense of sort of the political terrain that we are living in now, where we have a government that is actively kind of promoting nuclear weapons as absolutely sort of central core part of its military power, and is totally sort of pushing this war agenda. Having said that, it's pushing this war agenda from a position of weakness. We know that the British government is already incredibly unpopular. We've seen that from the very, very poor polling, consistently poor polling of the government, and particularly in terms of Keir Starmer's sort of popularity, but also in terms of the local elections, very sort of poor results there. Also we're seeing, despite those terrible results, we're seeing a determination, it seems, from the government to double down on these deeply, deeply unpopular policies. We're seeing sort of big attacks on living standards, no improvement on living standards, and continued sort of attacks on and cuts to public services. And these are rightly deeply, deeply unpopular, because this is, in the context of decades of people's living standards dropping. And we know that polling, shows that there's very large majorities that support, spending money on benefits, for people with disabilities to live, independently and with dignity, over increased military spending. Big majorities amongst Labour voters and particularly amongst Green voters. So there is no, there's no sort of mandate for these deeply unpopular policies that are sort of pushing this war agenda. But also obviously sort of Britain's Trump, Starmer, sorry, is sort of trying to sort of present on the one hand that Britain is kind of independent from Trump, but in reality, we've seen very clearly that the British government is working in lockstep with the Trump administration, and Trump is deeply unpopular. In terms of polling, this goes right across the political spectrum. Trump is deeply unpopular because primarily because it's really clear that Trump is pushing an agenda which is all about the sort of the self-interest of a small section of the American population. It's certainly not in the interest of the rest of the world, and certainly not in the interest of the British population. And that's also meaning that the so-called special relationship with the US, Britain's military relationship and military subordination to the US is coming under, a lot more pressure and a lot more scrutiny. And so I think it's kind of no surprise and very good news that we've seen an increase in opposition to Britain to nuclear weapons being based in Britain. So the latest polling shows that there's an increase by 2%. So now 61% of the population do not want Britain to be hosting US nuclear weapons. And I think that's because people rightly see that as being incredibly dangerous and totally putting Britain on the front line. So as I say, Britain's kind of nuclear dependence on the US is being seen as something that's not in our interest and is actually sort of dragging us towards, greater sort of dangers. We're also seeing, much higher levels of awareness about nuclear weapons now and about nuclear dangers, particularly, around the Ukraine war. That polling shows that people see the main risk of, of sort of the annihilation of the human species and the planet is being caused by nuclear war. So, much higher level of awareness around that. But also we're seeing the this kind of fear around nuclear weapons and real concern about the risk of sort of nuclear war, global nuclear war is really permeating kind of wider society and wider culture. People might know that the iconic horror film Threads, which is based on sort of factual evidence, and that's partly why it's so horrifying, about a nuclear bomb going off in a northern city in Sheffield and just rolling back British society to kind of medieval times. That is going to be made into a television series. And I think that shows, because there is a huge amount of kind of concern about this, but people want to be want to be sort of seeing these sort of programs. There's also lots of video games now where kind of nuclear annihilation, post-apocalyptic kind of worlds are very popular. That kind of premise is sort of very popular. So, really across our kind of culture now, there is much sort of higher level of awareness. And so it's really important that we seize on those opportunities to really get across the reality of nuclear weapons and get across the reality of nuclear war. And so, the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war is absolutely critical that we highlight that. Our governments are sort of talking about it in a very sort of, in some respects quite casual way about nuclear weapons and about developing nuclear weapons. But when we look at what the destructive power of those weapons, it's absolutely kind of horrifying. I mean, Britain's nuclear weapons are hugely powerful and very, very destructive. Each one of the 260 odd nuclear warheads that Britain has are 8 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, which killed over 200,000 people. Just one of the Trident submarines, if it was fully armed, could kill 64 million people. I mean, that is just a horrific, absolutely horrific figure. Britain's nuclear weapons are under NATO command. the US-led military alliance, you know, the biggest military alliance in the world, which has been aggressively expanding across the globe for decades now. You know, it's been sort of centrally involved in the Ukraine crisis. You know, basically we've seen a proxy war between NATO and Russia, which, you know, has created a situation where we've had the real threat of nuclear confrontation, you know, first time really since the Cold War. And what's been the role of the British government? Completely hawkish, and one of the most hawkish of NATO members, and has played an incredibly reckless and escalatory role in Ukraine, you know, and I think, you know, is contributed to pushing the region towards, you know, a sort of on the nuclear brink. I think, you know, a lot of us were very, very frightened at the end of last year when Britain, you know, was pushing to use these Storm Shadow missiles, and got Biden to agree for those Storm Shadow missiles to be used. We were all very, very, you know, frightened about what was going to happen. And yet here we are, like, you know, however many months on, and we've still got, you know, the British government now threatening to incinerate, you know, 40 Russian cities with its nuclear weapons. You know, this is the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of this government. Incredibly dangerous. Britain's also part of the AUKUS treaty. This is this nuclear alliance with the US and Australia, which is ostensibly a nuclear alliance against China. It's about sharing nuclear technology to make Australia, you know, a nuclear state, to have nuclear powered submarines, driving nuclear proliferation, and it would, you know, putting lots more nuclear hardware in the Asia Pacific in an incredibly kind of already very, very tense situation. So we're seeing, you know, a nuclear arms race is developing yet again, and Britain is totally part of that. And we know that Trump, you know, he has China in his sights. That's clear, you know, in terms of what's going on in relation to Ukraine. This has been talked about openly, you know, by the NATO Secretary General, you know, talking about how we're going to be seeing a coordination between Europe and the US, where Europe will be, you know, European NATO states will be arming up and rearming Europe so that the US can pivot towards the Asia Pacific, totally coordinated operation. So, you know, very, very dangerous situation, which really kind of risks a global confrontation that could go nuclear. So, you know, our role is, in terms of showing the sort of human cost of such a nuclear war, is absolutely vital. And of course, we know that the reality is absolutely horrifying. You know, we're in the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's absolutely critical that we really make sure that those voices are heard, and the reality, the horrific reality of nuclear war is never forgotten. And CND's campaigning is, you know, no more Hiroshimas, never again. We're working with, you know, we've got lots of things organised. We're promoting a student, for instance, at Kiel, who's created a virtual reality project where participants put on, you know, a virtual reality headset, and they are immersed in the horror of Hiroshima in the you know, the bombing aftermath. Again, you know, really important in terms of sort of getting that message across. We're going to be having a delegation going to Japan this year for the events that are taking place there. Jeremy Corbyn and Caroline Lucas, really important in terms of raising awareness and bringing those, you know, that message back to people here in Britain. There's also, we really got to raise awareness about the constant daily dangers of the nuclear weapons industry. You know, we have the constant risk of nuclear accidents, whether it's at bases or it's, you know, through nuclear submarines patrolling the seas. You know, we've had incidents, for instance, in Barrow-in-Furness, where they're building the dreadnought submarines. You know, there was a very serious fire there, you know, damage to those nuclear submarines. Tony has, you know, has spoken about the, you know, the horrific situation in terms of radioactive leaks. We have ongoing nuclear submarine accidents. I'm sure, you know, people will have been horrified by I think this is in 2023, where a depth gauge was faulty on a nuclear submarine, and the nuclear submarine was just diving towards the seabed. And it was only because another gauge was referred to that they realized that was happening, and they managed to rectify it. But, you know, this is a kind of situation that we're facing. And this is also because it's an aging fleet. And yet the government, you know, are determined to continue with, as it's called, the continuous at sea deterrence, yeah, which is putting all lives at risk, you know, from, as I say, these nuclear accidents. But also there's a reality of working on one of these nuclear submarines, which, you know, whilst Starmer's there kind of presenting it as, you know, something, you know, glorifying it and something, you know, amazing, and that, you know, young people should aspire to, the reality is completely different. You know, a couple of months ago you had Healy, that's the Defence Secretary, the British Defence Secretary, as well as the Prime Minister, hailing the sacrifice of submarine crew coming in on a record-breaking 204-day tour. Yeah, but the reality is those crew had no choice about how long that patrol went on for. It was double the time that it should have gone on for, and the reason being is because the other submarines weren't ready. And as I say, the government's so determined to continue this continuous at sea deterrence that it meant that those people had to be out for over 6 months. And we've seen really serious cases of abuse on board these submarines, including torture and sexual assault. But also we're seeing incidents where crew are going hungry because they have run out of food because these patrols are going on for so long. So, as I say, not so bright and not so hopeful. But this is the industry that the British government is, you know, is presenting as, and, you know, promoting as this kind of catalyst to growth, which, you know, Alex has spoken so eloquently about. Then there is the issue in terms of the impact on education. We're seeing a, you know, situation now where education is being, you know, trying to be shaped into a kind of conveyor belt for the arms industry. So really kind of promoting militarism, which is deeply concerning on many levels. But also we're seeing the kind of attempts to sort of shut down freedom of expression in universities as well, in terms of opposition to war. But there's huge amount of pushback on this. You know, the growing out of the divestment campaigns against Israel. We're seeing a real widening in terms of like anti-militarism campaigns from the education trade unions to students themselves. You know, lots of student unions are passing ethical careers policies where they will not allow arms companies to come in to their, you know, to their careers fairs. You know, there's lots of activity on campus as well to, you know, to oppose arms companies. Then there's taking up the whole devastating economic and social impact on our society, as these hundreds of billions are wasted on these weapons. You know, in Britain today, you know, on average, 30% of children are living in poverty. And in areas such as, you know, Tower Hamlets, it's 51% of children are living in poverty. You know, that's a reality of the choices that our governments are making. And that's similarly the case, as Tony as you know, has highlighted, in terms of communities in Barrow and Devonport. You know, there's big pockets of poverty there. That, you know, these are not prosperous communities, and they are having to live day in, day out with these nuclear dangers. And then, of course, you know, and I suppose, you know, this is sort of sort of a newer development in some way. There's a political cost to us as a society and our communities, as this war rhetoric is sort of driving ultra nationalism and also racism, which is all about trying to divide our communities, and is incredibly dangerous, as we all know. So it's absolutely vital that we are working with anti-racist organisations to challenge this. Absolutely critical, rather than, you know, what we're seeing from the government, which is this obscene doubling down. So, you know, this is why our protests at these bases like Devonport, at Barrow, are so important, because it's about really showing the reality of this the sort of militarism, you know, and a war economy that our government's peddling. You know, these are people who have to live day in and day out, you know, right next to these nuclear bases, and you know, it's really, really grim. We have found that the protests that we've had at Barrow, for instance, have been really successful. You know, for a community that's dominated by the basically, you know, British Aerospace, just sort of one arms company. We weren't sure what kind of, you know, what kind of reception we were going to get, and we were really, really surprised. It was very, very positive. We had kind of people stopping to join the protest, and it really kind of exposed the kind of the lies behind this kind of economic dynamism. You know, you had a population that are, you know, living in poverty, are not benefiting from those, you know, what better paid jobs. The people who are, you know, who have got those better paid jobs, they don't live in Barrow, they live outside. And so it's those people that are, you know, not benefiting, but also they're the ones that are having to sort of take the iodine tablets. So, you know, as Sarah said, you know, this is a campaign that's like got a local aspect to it, it's a national aspect to it, but also an international aspect to it, because, you know, we know that this is like as we've got to build an international movement against nuclear weapons and for nuclear disarmament. Here in Britain, we need a new political leadership that is going to ditch the arms drive and this war drive, which is threatening global war that could go nuclear. We need a leadership that prioritizes global cooperation, that recognizes the need for nuclear disarmament, for promoting arms control treaties, but also recognizes that it has to abide by its international obligations, not only to disarm, but also to provide development, you know, to provide like a framework where we can end global inequality, and of course to meet its climate targets, which is absolutely vital if we are going to have any kind of future worth, you know, worth living in. So, but we feel that more and more the starkness of what we're facing means that there's a greater interconnectedness going on, and a much greater appetite for different movements to work together, and that's absolutely critical, because the stronger we are, the quicker we're going to win.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So many crucial points there for us to sort of absorb and take into account. We will do a few questions now. There'll be just enough time for all the speakers to respond to your queries and to give any final thoughts they may have after listening to their fellow speakers. In the chat as well, Linda Williams has shared a link to an Atomic Cabaret tour that she is performing. I think it's Linda's tour this summer. So take a look at that. I think there's performances sort of dotted around the country, because I think Sophie alluded to sort of there's more and more cultural events around this topic now, which kind of shows it's getting that reach that perhaps it wasn't getting even just a few years ago. Okay, so I'll read out some of the questions, and then I'll take you in the order of Tony, Alex, and Sophie. If you could stick to about sort of 3 or 4 minutes, and take out the responses to the things that are most relevant to you, and then we'll sort of end around 8 o'clock. So Sophie's already alluded to this, but our link with the US. So how can someone please give details on just how unindependent our nuclear missiles are? Don't they have to be regularly carted across the Atlantic for the Americans to serve? So that specific link with the US. Tom Cuthbert is asking for a bit more context to a statement that was said a bit earlier. We are in a pre-war situation. Do the speakers think we're being conditioned for more military conflict and to make it acceptable in the public mind? So that's that. And then this Chris Preston's question ties in with another one. So Chris asks, where there is several thousand jobs reliant on subs and arms, we have to develop policy to show alternatives at the same time as ban the bomb. And I would just link with that. So what are those alternatives and how do we communicate those to the workers? What is the best method for that within our campaign? And then just to follow up on what Tony was saying about life in Plymouth, what is the impact sort of on the community of all these safety breaches and accidents in particular? What is it like sort of psychologically living near a nuclear base? So just a few different topics there, and it'd be great if you could go into the ones that are most relevant to you as speakers. We will start with Tony.
Well, I mean, they're great questions. The psychological impact is very important because it's very depressing. It is a repressive experience being anywhere around the nuclear dockyard. Luckily, people in the richer areas of the east, we're very strange because usually it's the west that's the rich part and the east that's the poor, and Plymouth is the other way around because of the dockyard. But luckily, people on the east don't really have any contact with the dockyard. But if you are around it, and I am, we have a siren that does the all clear at 11:30 a.m. every Monday, just to remind us that there's a nuclear establishment here and that there could be an accident, but there won't be because everything's fine. And so what we have is a remarkable amount of propaganda to say everything's fine, whilst we have this dominant military complex that inhabits all of our psyches. It's worse than that, really, because another one of the questions is about what's the alternatives. And I think people should understand that the dockyard has incredible levels of the most modern technology and skills, because, you know, splitting the atom and creating a nuclear heat to actually drive turbines is very, very complex and technical. And these submarines of themselves have small nuclear reactors. And you might understand why I say small nuclear reactors, because these are now being developed nationally and internationally as the answer to our electricity problems, that instead of coal, you are going to have a couple of streets down from you, a small modular reactor, which is based on exactly the design of these leaking hulks that I showed you earlier, that they don't know what to do with. They don't know how to shut them down. They don't know what to do with the nuclear waste, and they don't know how to actually get rid of them. This is absolute madness. In other words, we can show the alternatives such as the underwater turbine, such as wind turbines, and we have been doing this significantly and continuously for the last 30 years in Plymouth to say the dockyard would be a fantastic place for electricity generating turbines to be produced and to be marketed internationally. We could be a very wealthy city, in fact, in a much even wealthier country, if only it wasn't a nuclear weaponry rather than actually solving the climate crisis. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tony. And moving on to Alex.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think David Pedder in the questions has asked the question to which no British politician ever gives an honest answer, which is, of course, the so-called independent nuclear deterrent is not an independent. It's neither. The only thing it is nuclear. It's not independent and it's not a deterrent. But it's missiles cannot be fired without the Americans giving permission, And I believe I'm right in saying, David, that while the British Navy owns the submarines, we lease the missiles. The nuclear missiles are leased from the Americans. It's a bit like owning a gun but renting the bullets. So yes, it's a farcical situation. But I want to just turn to Chris Preston's important point, which I think all too often people kind of avoid this, and it's really important. What he says, where there are several thousand jobs reliant on submarines or arms manufacturing, we have to develop policy to show alternatives at the same time as just calling to ban the bomb. And that's absolutely right. And there is a long history of the labour movement in this country, trade unions and people in the Labour Party and in the Communist Party and elsewhere, trying to develop policy around defence diversification. As recently as 2017, the TUC Congress called on Labour to establish a shadow defence diversification agency. Of course, that was under a very different leadership within the Labour Party, but the TUC then was calling for Labour to develop a national industrial strategy, including arms conversion, so converting arms manufacturing jobs away from arms manufacturing towards civilian manufacturing. And indeed, that came from a debate that was initiated by the Newcastle Trades Council, which referenced, as they often do, these debates, the 1976 Lucas Plan. And I get a bit frustrated by people referring to the Lucas Plan because, of course, next year it will be 50 years since the Lucas Plan was published. And we've got very little to show for it, apart from some very nice intentions. But the trade union movement needs to start developing now a program for what arms conversion looks like and what are the real alternatives to these jobs in the arms manufacturing industry and in the supply chain, because there is the skills, as Tony Staunton has just said, the skills in those industries are the same skills that are needed to develop turbines for wind technology, for wave technology, for wave power, wave energy technology. These are key engineering skills, and we're allowing them to be taken out of our economy, out of our country, through the global supply chain, which is controlled not by us, not even by our government, but by American transnational corporations. So it's really important that the trade union movement wakes up and understands that it's our responsibility to start putting an alternative based on arms conversion to this lame duck industry, which we're supporting at the moment with our taxes. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Arms conversion is a hugely important point, and C&D has a trade union advisory group which works to pressure trade unions to work on this kind of issues. So if you're a C&D supporter and also a member of a trade union, please get in touch if you would like to be part of that work, which is absolutely crucial, as Alex has just said. And finally, for the responses to the questions, we'll go to Sophie.
Okay, thanks. Yes, so this very important point about how Britain's nuclear weapons are not independent. I mean, Alex has sort of spoken about it, but also it's as well as like Britain leasing the missiles from the US from a pool. And I think that's why there is some agitation amongst some sections of, for instance, within sort of the Labour Party, Labour government, but also sort of in the Conservative Party, is, what happens if Trump were to say, oh no, you can't lease those missiles anymore? What would happen? So big fear about that. But I don't think that's likely. I think what we're seeing is that that Britain is like it's subordinated to the US, and it's definitely going to do what the US tells it. And I don't think there's any sort of chance of the US kind of changing that. I mean, this is an agreement that's been in existence since 1958 in terms of this nuclear sharing agreement through the Mutual Defence Agreement, and that's how Britain has been able to get this technology from the US. So as I say, as well as kind of leasing missiles, it also has this kind of integrated targeting system. So Britain's nuclear submarines actually, the targeting of that and the decision about what, what's being targeted is supposedly a kind of joint decision with the US. But in reality, Britain's nuclear weapons are under NATO command. So that means that ultimately it's NATO's going to be deciding where those nuclear submarines go and like what they're targeting, sort of not Britain. So I think that's important too, but also in terms of kind of ongoing nuclear technology, the new nuclear warhead that's being developed at Aldermaston, that's a joint program with the US, which is also running massively behind and massively over budget, as are all these kind of programs. So it just kind of shows you the degree to which the integration with the sort of the US military machine is it's so deep. But I think that's another reason why this kind of dynamic that's shifting in relation to sort of the Trump administration is sort of very significant, and why we have to really be kind of exposing these nuclear dangers and exposing this dependence, because people don't now feel that the US is an ally and has got kind of Britain's back. So it is and obviously it doesn't, so it's really important that we kind of expose that. And then just this question, I think, about kind of is the British public being kind of conditioned for sort of future kind of military conflicts? Of course it is. I mean, that's definitely what's going on. That's why I think we're seeing such obscene levels of kind of reckless, like warmongering rhetoric from this government and and the previous government as well, which is all about kind of to justify these massive Cold War level military spending increases, but also to prepare the population for for potentially another world war, which would be absolutely kind of catastrophic. But as I say, I think there isn't that kind of support, and people are very, very concerned about their economic situation, and also there are big sections of the population that totally understand the risks in relation to this kind of big rise in kind of ultra nationalism and the rise of the far right. So there are big kind of contradictions in all of this, but that's definitely what's kind of going on. And like CND is sort of working with like peace organizations across Europe. There's a big movement that's kind of developing now against this kind of rise in European militarism. There was a big sort of demonstration in Rome. Over 50,000 people took part in a protest that was against this kind of rise in militarism. There was a very, very big protest in Germany at one of the US bases there. So so things are definitely shifting, and I think that's also because the economic situation and the kind of the political situation in Europe is is very, very unstable, and sort of economically people are really sort of suffering as a consequence of the Ukraine war and of their government's sort of terrible sort of warmongering policies.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. Apologies if we didn't get to your one, but hopefully there'll be more opportunities in the future on a webinar and in-person meetings to discuss these issues. So keep an eye on C&D social media accounts. Please follow us if you don't already, to hear about all the webinars and the events we organise. But the most important event coming from this webinar is, of course, the demonstration at Devonport itself on June the 7th. So we encourage everyone to get there if you can. We appreciate it. It's a few hours away on the train, but it will be worth it to sort of be there on the day and protest against the sort of Britain's nuclear weapon system as a whole. If you can help us distribute leaflets or share graphics on social media, please let us know. We can get you the resources that you need for that. So yes, please support that demonstration. So my final thanks is to the speakers. There was so much interesting information there, so well communicated. We have recorded it and it will be available for people to watch back or to share as well. Also, thanks to my colleague Rachel for helping with all the technology to make sure it's running today. And again, thanks to you all for joining us and being part of this campaign to get rid of these weapons of mass destruction. So see you again, and thanks everyone. Bye.